The air in Precinct 13 was a stale mix of old coffee and fear, a constant, low-frequency hum that only the seasoned veterans noticed. Detective Elias Vance, a man whose face was a roadmap of late nights and bad decisions, certainly did. He was an officer molded by the city's worst, the faceless alleys, the wet gleam of cheap neon, the sudden, wet thud of violence. But the fire that landed on his desk late one Tuesday was different. It felt cold, even through the thin manila. The case was designated the Ash Heap Anomaly. Officially, it was a string of missing persons confined to Sector 7, the city's burnt-out industrial heart, a place where the factories had gone quiet 20 years ago, leaving skeletal brick husks and a permanent smell of soot and decay. 6 people in 4 months, all low-income, transient, and, crucially, completely unrelated. No witnesses, no calls, no ransom notes. The initial police report called them walk-offs. Vance knew better. He knew a vacuum when he saw one dotted hook lay in the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. The only thing recovered from the last missing person, a drifter named Ben Fingers Riley, was his wristwatch, found lodged between 2 jagged pieces of concrete near the entrance of the defunct Pyre-Steel Smelter. It wasn't the watch itself that showed Vance. It was what had been done to it. The watch, the cheap, digital Casio, was intact. No scratches, no dents, no blood. But the internal components, the plastic circuit board, the microwires, the lithium battery, they had all been reduced to a fine, bone-white powder, a particulate so delicate it crumbled when the forensic tech tried to lift it. The report used the word calcified. Like it was aged 1,000 years in a second, Detective, the chief medical examiner, Dr. Anya Sharma, had told him over the phone, her voice tight with professional unease. Whatever force did this, it didn't burn it, Vance. It erased the structure. We ran it through X-ray diffraction. The plastic is cinder. But cold. Completely cold. Vance tapped a cigarette on the edge of the fire, his eyes fixed on the evidence photo, a pristine watch casing holding nothing but dust. The fire metaphor was too easy. He called his partner, Detective Lena Cruz. Cruz was sharp, meticulous, and had a dangerous habit of seeing the things Vance missed, the human cracks in the concrete. Sector 7, Vance grumbled into the phone. The smelter. Bring a flashlight and maybe a hazmat suit. The city wants this to be nothing, but the paperwork smells like a cover-up. The Ash Heap Anomaly, Cruz replied, her voice crackling with static and anticipation. I read the brief. Calcified plastics. That's new, even for this town. Meet you there in 20. Don't touch anything, Elias. You know how you are with evidence. Vance hung up, the smoke from his cigarette curling toward the ceiling fan, mixing with the air of the precinct's suffocating normalcy. The Pyre-Steel Smelter was a monument to industrial dread. A monstrous, 10-story building of reinforced concrete and rusted steel, it stood silhouetted against the weak twilight, its stacks like dead, accusing fingers. The place hadn't seen a flame in decades, yet the air near it always felt strangely thin and warm. Vance and Cruz approached the main loading bay. The heavy steel doors, meant to withstand a bomb blast, were slightly ajar, just enough to let a person slip through. The lock was untouched. The wind, maybe. Cruz suggested, shining her powerful LED into the black gap. It hasn't been windy in a week, Lena, Vance countered, drawing his sidearm. And this door weighs 5 tons. He pushed the door, straining against the rusted hinges, and it yielded with a groan that sounded less like metal and more like a dying breath. The interior was absolute darkness, a void so complete that even Cruz's powerful beam seemed to struggle, the light swallowed immediately by the dust-choked air. But the light did catch on one thing, a series of faint, almost transparent footprints in the decades of accumulated ash on the floor. They were bare footprints. And they were heading in. Ben Riley wore boots, Cruz whispered, her hand instinctively resting on her own weapon. So did the last 5, Vance said, his voice low and gritty. He stepped over the threshold, his flashlight cutting a nervous arc through the gloom. The air inside was not stale, but sterile, like the inside of a tomb, and it held a pervasive, subtle aroma that made the hairs on Vance's neck prickle. It smelled faintly, distinctly, of fresh rain on hot pavement. An impossible smell in a dry, abandoned smelter. Vance took 5 steps, then stopped dead. His light found the wall, where a single, crude message had been scratched into the steel support beam, high above the ground, too high for any human to reach without a ladder. The message wasn't written in blood or paint. It looked like it had been scored by something white-hot, but the edges were smooth and clean. It simply read, "Center, the furnace is not empty." Before either detective could move, the heavy steel door slammed shut behind them with a deafening, final crash. A plume of ancient, cold ash rose from the impact, and in the sudden, absolute darkness, a sound began, a distant, mechanical scream that felt less like machinery and more like a human throat being shredded. The sound was coming from deep within the smelter's core, and it was getting closer. The reverberating crash of the main door still echoed in the vast, light-swallowing cavern of the Pyre-Steel Smelter. Detective Cruz reacted instantly, swinging her flashlight back, her pistol already leveled. "Elias." "The lock," she shouted, her voice tight. Vance was already grappling with the massive steel panel. The air, which moments ago smelled faintly of rain, now reeked of ozone and hot metal. He pressed his shoulder against the door, straining, but the rusted hinges had seized up completely, locked tight by some immense, unseen force. "It's jammed." Vance grunted, pulling his hand away just as a high-pitched, mechanical scream ripped through the darkness again, much closer this time. It wasn't the sound of grinding gears, it had a terrifying cadence, a fluctuating pitch that mimicked a human being in agony, stretched and amplified by the factory's echoing chambers. Cruz's light beam danced wildly. "That thing is moving, Vance. We need to go deeper." The logic was chillingly sound. They were trapped, and the source of the noise was approaching from the entrance. Their only path was forward, into the deeper, darker heart of the abandoned smelter. Vance switched tactics, tucking his gun away and pulling out a heavy-duty tactical knife, kicking the door in frustration. "Let's move." "We follow the footprints, Lena. Keep the light low." They pushed into the main furnace chamber, a cathedral-like space dominated by 2 monstrous, cylindrical kilns, each large enough to melt an entire train car. The bare footprints in the ash continued, leading directly toward the base of the nearest kiln. As they walked, Cruz's light caught something on the concrete floor between the kilns. She stopped, drawing a sharp breath. "Elias, look," she whispered, pointing. There, lying neatly placed on the ash, were 6 items. A cheap gold wedding band. A laminated library card. A small, charred, but still legible photograph of a dog. A set of worn car keys. A broken harmonica. And a child's red plastic toy soldier. 6 missing persons. 6 personal effects, but the real shock was the temperature. Vance knelt, hesitantly touching the metal key. It was icy, radiating a profound, unnatural coldness that made his skin crawl. "They didn't just walk off," Cruz murmured, her voice laced with dread. "Whatever is in here, it's collecting them. And it didn't burn this. It froze them." Vance stood up, his gaze sweeping the enormous, silent kiln before them. It was a perfect, sealed cylinder of thick, soot-stained steel. "The furnace is not empty," he repeated the cryptic message from the wall. "Maybe it's not a furnace anymore, Lena. Maybe it's a vault." As they edged around the base of the kiln, the bare footprints suddenly stopped. No scuff marks, no drag lines. They simply ended as if the person had lifted straight into the air. Vance felt a terrible stillness descend, a weight of silence that was heavier and more terrifying than the previous screaming. He shone his light up the sheer steel wall of the kiln. Midway up, spanning over 10 feet across the surface, was a massive, dark stain. It wasn't blood or oil. It was a perfect, 2-dimensional imprint, a silhouette of a man spread-eagled against the metal. The outline was composed entirely of ash. The same fine, bone-white powder that was found in the calcified watch. He was pressed against it. Vance breathed, his throat dry. Pressed until there was nothing left but dust. Before he could finish the thought, a low, guttural thrumming started, vibrating through the concrete floor and up into their boots. The sound was not coming from the entrance, nor the main chamber. It was coming from inside the kiln. The enormous steel cylinder shuddered once. Then, an archaic, almost biological sound of grinding stone and wet friction filled the air as the massive, decade-sealed access hatch on the side of the kiln began to slowly, agonizingly open. A vertical seam of brilliant, unnatural white light appeared. It wasn't the color of fire or electricity, but something impossibly pure and cold, like staring into the heart of a broken diamond, and from that light, a voice, a mere whisper that resonated inside Vance's skull, spoke. It wasn't a human voice. It was a cacophony of overlapping echoes, all speaking the same one word. The whisper of empty seemed to suck the oxygen from the vast chamber, leaving the air impossibly thin. The brilliant, cold white light pouring from the opening kiln hatch intensified, burning away the gloom. Detective Vance raised his pistol, squinting through the blinding glare. Police. Don't move. A figure stepped out of the light. It was roughly human-shaped, tall and gaunt, but not flesh and blood. It was composed of tightly compressed, bone-white cinder. It looked like a walking, solidified column of the same calcified ash they had found in the watch, held together by sheer, unnatural force. Its surface was brittle and ridged, like dried volcanic residue. Where its eyes should have been were two vertical slits of that pure, blinding white light. The creature made no sound, but as it moved, the temperature in the chamber plummeted. Frost instantly bloomed on the surrounding pipes and rusted steelwork. Cruz let out a choked gasp, not of fear, but of profound, freezing shock. It's the anomaly, Elias. It's the calcification. The Cinder Man raised a long, spindly arm. Its movement was too quick, too fluid for something made of stone and dust. The arm didn't reach for them. Instead, it reached out and touched the heavy steel handrail nearest to Vance. There was no sound, no spark, no hiss. The moment the entity's finger made contact, the thick, rusted rail instantly turned matte white. A second later, the entire section, about 3 feet long, crumbled with a faint shhh sound, collapsing into a heap of fine, chalky powder. It wasn't physical contact that was the threat, it was the transference of a profound, structure-annihilating code. Vance fired. Bang. Bang. 2 shots, aimed center mass. The .40 caliber round struck the Cinder Man's chest. Instead of penetrating, the bullets hit the dense ash, and in a sickening blink, the copper jackets and lead cores were instantaneously reduced to 2 puffs of white dust that scattered harmlessly. Guns are useless. Cruz yelled, backing away rapidly. We need something physical, something hot. The creature took a step, and the thrumming that began inside the kiln intensified, vibrating the concrete so violently that small fissure spider webbed across the floor. The bare footprints in the ash began to stir, coalescing slightly around the Cinder Man's feet. Get to the conveyors. Vance shouted, grabbing Cruz's arm. The conveyor belt mechanism, designed to transport iron ore, provided the only immediate cover. As they scrambled toward the rusted metal trough of the belt system, the Cinder Man raised its head, and a sound like 10,000 voices whispering in unison filled the space. Want. Empty. Warm. The entity moved surprisingly fast, sliding over the ash-covered floor toward them. It swept its arm across the floor, and the decades-old suit beneath them was instantly drawn up, adhering to its body, making it larger, denser, and its movement smoother. Cruz, running backwards, noticed a small detail, a broken steam pipe overhead, slowly leaking condensation onto a patch of the floor. The water instantly froze into a small sheet of ice, but the Cinder Man seemed to subtly veer away from the wet patch. Water, Elias. It's reacting to moisture. Cruz shouted, pointing frantically to a large, emergency coolant valve on the wall near a vertical maintenance ladder. Vance saw the opportunity. The creature was almost upon them, now a massive, hulking shape of moving cinder. The air around them was thick and aching with cold. "Cover me," Vance yelled. He bolted toward the coolant valve, an enormous, rusted wheel. He jammed the point of his tactical knife into the wheel spokes and strained, his muscles burning. The Cinder Man was less than 10 feet away. It was no longer running, but floating, its silent form radiating a lethal, consuming chill. With a final, desperate heave, Vance wrenched the coolant valve open. Pffffsshhhh, a deafening geyser of pressurized, scalding steam and dirty water erupted from the pipe, blasting across the chamber. The hot moisture immediately hit the Cinder Man. There was no explosion, no burn. Instead, the entity recoiled with a terrible, silent violence. The compressed cinder on its surface began to fizzle, not from heat, but from dissolution. Where the steam hit, the calcified material instantly turned back into a soft, wet mud that slid off the creature's form and evaporated on the hot pipe. The blast of steam bought them a precious few seconds. "Ladder. Now!" Vance yelled. They scrambled up the nearest maintenance ladder, ascending rapidly into the dark, tangled network of overhead pipes and ventilation shafts, leaving the geyser of steam blasting at the center of the chamber. As they reached the first overhead gantry, Vance risked a look back. The Cinder Man was standing in the cloud of steam, its form visibly diminished, sputtering, but not destroyed. It raised its head, the twin slits of white light fixing on their position high above. Then, the drumming from the floor stopped. The entity simply dissolved, collapsing back into a swirling vortex of white ash that drifted down onto the floor of the smelter. For a moment, there was silence. Vance gripped the cold railing, catching his breath. "Did we?" "No," Cruz cut him off, pointing her light down. The cloud of ash on the floor began to move, not dissipating, but flowing, a dry, chalky current that crept along the concrete toward the base of the maintenance ladder, where the water from the steam valve couldn't reach. The Cinder Man was not destroyed. It was reconstituting. And now, it knew they were warm, and it knew where they were. The chilling realization that the entity could simply dissolve and flow like sand was a gut punch. Detective Vance and Detective Cruz scrambled higher, the metal rungs of the maintenance ladder agonizingly cold against their palms. Below, the swirl of white ash, moments ago scattered by the steam, began to gather speed, churning like water draining from a colossal basin. It flowed silently toward the base of the ladder, then began to climb. Not as a solid mass, but as a creeping, dry inverse of a liquid, adhering to the metal and concrete, slowly reforming the outline of the Cinder Man on the vertical surface. "Keep moving, Lena. Don't look down," Vance urged, his breath ragged. They hauled themselves onto a narrow catwalk, 30 feet above the main floor. This level was a spaghetti bowl of abandoned ventilation shafts, rusted service pipes, and catwalks that spanned the entire length of the building, a dizzying, structural nightmare built for maintenance workers who were long gone. Cruz took the lead, her tactical light cutting paths through the blackness, revealing only more rust and shadows. "The steam bought us time, but it's rebuilding faster now," she panted, her voice echoing unevenly in the confined space. "It knows we're up here. Heat rises, Elias. We're the warmest things in this whole damn sector." Vance stopped beside a massive, 9-foot-wide ventilation shaft, its metal grill half torn away. He checked his sidearm again, the bullets now feeling utterly pointless. "We need a place to make a stand, Lena, or find an exit," Vance said, peering into the shaft. A rush of dry, icy air gusted out, carrying the faint scent of rain and old rust. This vent must lead somewhere. Could be an escape route. As if responding to their thought, a profound sense of pressure descended. The metal around them began to vibrate, not from the floor this time, but from the air itself. The subtle thrumming was back, closer, higher. Then, Vance saw it. Along the horizontal span of a 20-inch wide pressure pipe, a thin line of bone white ash began to appear, flowing out of the pipe seam like dry smoke. The flow quickly thickened, solidifying, and the Cinder Man, now reduced in size to a slender, coiled shape, emerged directly from the pipe wall, reassembling itself instantly on the catwalk 10 feet behind them. It hadn't climbed. It had traveled through the factory's infrastructure, using the vents and pipes as its arteries. The structure itself is its weapon. Cruz screamed, firing two desperate, futile shots that dissipated into dust upon impact. Into the vent. Now. They plunged through the broken grille and into the ventilation shaft. It was a metal tunnel large enough to crawl through, leading sharply downward into darkness. They slid, scraping their knees and elbows on the jagged edges, the sounds of their panicked movements muffled by the metal shell. Behind them, the Cinder Man slid smoothly into the shaft opening. The air that followed them was a concentrated wave of consuming, unnatural cold. Where does this go? Vance yelled over the scraping metal. The blueprint said it leads to the sub-level utility tunnels. The original cooling system. Cruz shouted back. If we can make it to the cooling system, we might find the main water pump. She was cut short. The sound of their heavy fall came moments after her words. The floor of the vent system abruptly ended. They dropped maybe 12 feet, hitting a solid, earthen floor with a jarring oof that knocked the air from Vance's lungs. They were in a low-ceilinged, circular tunnel. This was not the dry, dusty smelter, but a damp, subterranean maze smelling of mildew and stagnant water. They had found the utility tunnels, or perhaps, the catacombs beneath Sector 7. The white light of the Cinder Man peered down at them from the vent opening above, illuminating their surroundings. The tunnel was lined with old, salt-stained brick, and running along the center were two parallel sets of rusted, abandoned train tracks, and on the tracks, in the tunnel ahead, were piles of objects, not 6 objects like before. Hundreds. Thousands. Old toys, cheap jewelry, discarded tools, half-melted plastic. A vast collection of lost, transient possessions, stretching as far as their flashlights could reach. The belongings of the long-forgotten, they disappeared. It's a collection, Elias, Cruz whispered, her voice trembling. It's been here for decades, gathering. The Cinder Man dropped silently from the vent opening, its form already rebuilding, gaining size and density from the dust and ash it had brought with it. The faint, echoing whisper of its voice was clearer now, more coherent, and overwhelmingly sat center. The warmth. The core. Must be empty. Again. It was referring to them. They were the warmth, the core, that it needed to consume to return the tunnel to its desired state of empty. The creature took one step, and the floor where its foot landed instantly calcified, the dirt and brick turning to white powder. Vance saw the only hope. 10 yards ahead, on the tunnel ceiling, was a red, industrial pipe labeled, main coolant feed line, 12 bar. The pipe, Lena. We need to break that pipe. Vance screamed, pushing Cruz forward. They ran along the old train tracks, kicking up the dust of forgotten lives, the Cinder Man silently gliding after them, its destructive touch turning everything in its path to dust. Vance and Cruz sprinted along the narrow-gauge tracks of the utility tunnel. Behind them, the Cinder Man gained ground, its whisper chorus of empty, warm, echoing off the slick brick walls. Each step the creature took left a rapidly expanding patch of calcified, powdery earth. Vance pointed his light at the massive red pipe overhead, the main coolant feed line. The valve is too far. I need to rupture the line. Vance yelled, his voice strained. He pulled out his tactical knife. The pressure is 12 bar, Elias. That's high-pressure water. It'll shred us. Cruz countered, but even as she spoke, she knew it was their only chance against the ash entity. The Cinder Man was less than 20 feet away. Its twin slits of white light focused on them, and the atmosphere became so cold that Vance's lungs seized up with a sharp, icy pain. The piles of forgotten objects on the trackside began to shudder, lightly vibrating as the Cinder Man drew close, incorporating the dry, dusty remnants of the disappeared into its growing mass. I need leverage, Vance shouted. He spotted a rusted pickaxe leaning against the wall, a tool left by long-dead maintenance workers. He snatched it, its cold metal familiar in his hand. He scrambled onto the top of an abandoned ore cart, using its unstable frame for height. With a desperate yell, he swung the heavy pickaxe, aiming for the pipe's largest weld point. Clang, the heavy steel pipe barely dented. The Cinder Man was 10 feet away, its ghostly, ash-made hand outstretched, its silent touch promising annihilation. The metallic scent of ozone was suffocating. Vance swung again, channeling every ounce of fear and adrenaline into the strike. Kang, the weak, rusted seam of the 40-year-old pipe finally gave way with a deafening, metallic shriek. A blast of incredibly high pressure, freezing cold water erupted from the fissure. It was a violent, directed torrent, not spray, aimed right at the advancing Cinder Man. The entity was engulfed. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The water didn't just dissolve the cinder, it hit the compressed, calcified ash with the force of a million tiny hydraulic presses. The Cinder Man didn't melt, it exploded in a cloud of dirty water and fine white powder. The explosion was silent but powerful, like a pressure release valve blown wide open. Vance and crews were instantly soaked and knocked off their feet by the pressure wave, the pickaxe skittering away into the darkness. They lay gasping on the wet tracks, the roaring torrent of the broken feed line flooding the tunnel. The water rose rapidly, instantly covering the tracks and beginning to submerge the piles of collected belongings. It's gone. Cruz coughed, wiping the cold water from her eyes. Vance struggled to his knees, his flashlight beam cutting through the spray. The air was blessedly warmer now, filled with the smell of wet earth and copper. "I don't think we killed it, Lena," Vance said, his teeth chattering from the cold and shock. "We just washed it away. Diluted it." As the tunnel rapidly flooded, his light beam caught something on the far wall, revealed by the rising water washing away years of grime. The brickwork was different here. An arched entrance, previously obscured by sediment, was now visible. It led to a much smaller, darker passage above the arch. A faded inscription in archaic industrial lettering was visible, "The Heart of Pyre-Steel, Foundation 1947. "The core," Vance muttered, pushing through the cold water that was already reaching his ankles. "This must be where the original furnace was built. Before the kills." They waded quickly toward the opening, leaving the sound of the raging water main behind them. The passage narrowed quickly. The air here was drier, still cold, but holding a strange, concentrated energy. It was a rough-hewn tunnel, smelling of limestone and iron. They found themselves in a spherical chamber, no larger than a small storage room, located directly beneath where the main furnace kiln stood on the floor above. In the center of the chamber was a single object. A massive, perfectly carved orb of black, glassy material, about 4 feet high, resting on a stone pedestal. It looked like obsidian, but its surface was matte and seemed to absorb all light, and radiating from the orb was an intense, palpable coldness. The true source of the phenomenon affixed to the pedestal was a single, tarnished brass plaque. Cruz approached it, shivering, and read the inscription aloud. "For the eternal satiety of the hearth. We offer the heat of the earth, and demand the silence of the soul." Suddenly, the black orb began to emit a deep, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of an impossibly large, slow-beating heart. The sound vibrated through the rock. "Lena, that's not natural," Vance whispered, training his gun on the orb, though he knew it was pointless. The surface of the black orb began to glisten with a fine, white powder, emanating from its very core. The calcified ash was being expelled from the heart of the anomaly. The powder flowed down the pedestal and began to quickly pool on the floor, collecting itself, reforming. Vance's eyes widened in horror. The Cinder Man wasn't the monster, Lena. It was the waste. The orb is shedding it, expelling it to seek out heat. As the Cinder Man began to coalesce for the third time, rising faster, denser, and stronger than before, Vance noticed a faint, pulsating red glow deep inside the black orb. The coolant, Vance breathed, realizing the terrible truth. "We cooled the structure, but we didn't stop the engine. We just pissed off the core." He remembered the bare footprints, the feeling of warm air in the dead factory, the whispered word, warmth. "It's feeding on internal heat, Elias. The latent geothermal energy of the earth. It's an anti-furnace. Cruz yelled, backing away towards the tunnel entrance. The Cinder Man was fully reformed now, twice the height of a man, and its white eyes were blazing with furious, focused light. It didn't whisper this time. It let out a single, soundless, telepathic roar that felt like a drill boring through their minds. The Cinder Man, now fully reformed and twice as large, was a monumental silhouette against the faint red pulse within the black orb. It glided toward them, its presence radiating a bone-deep, despairing cold that promised obliteration. "Get behind the pedestal," Vance commanded, shoving Cruz toward the stone base supporting the orb. Cruz slid, taking cover behind the thick stone. "Elias, we can't shoot it. We can't burn it. We just flooded it and it came back stronger." Vance was staring at the black orb, the source of the evil. It beat with a slow, heavy thump, thump, thump. "It's not an anti-furnace, Lena. It's a thermodynamic battery," Vance realized, the years of road police training giving way to a desperate, wild logic. The plaque said it demands the silence of the soul. It takes the energy, the heat, from living things, converts it into this hypercold ash, and feeds the core. The core stays cold and stable as long as the Cinder Man is feeding it. He looked at the reforming ash creature. "We didn't kill it with water. We saturated its fuel, forcing the core to violently expel the excess, the Cinder Man, to restart the feeding cycle." The Cinder Man was less than 5 feet away. Its huge, ashen hands were rising. Vance knew that if he was touched, he would cease to exist in a puff of cold powder. "We have to stop the core from functioning," Vance yelled. "What destroys a battery?" "A shock." His eyes fixed on the heavy-gauge, abandoned electrical cables that snaked along the ceiling, main power feeds for the original smelter equipment. The power cables. "Lena, the main lines. They are still connected to the grid. If we can drop those cables onto the orb, maybe the residual current." The Cinder Man let out another telepathic roar, a wave of mental noise that briefly paralyzed Cruz. Vance, however, found a savage kind of clarity in the face of oblivion. He took a running start up the rough-hewn stone wall, scrambling for purchase in the narrow space. He reached a small, protruding metal bracket and hauled himself onto the ceiling, his fingertips grazing the thick, rubber-sheet cables. He drew his tactical knife again, a last, pathetic tool against an elemental force. The Cinder Man, sensing his intent, turned its focus upward. It began to climb the wall after him, leaving a trail of instantly calcified, dissolving brick. "Elias, look out!" Cruz screamed. Vance ignored her. He saw the largest power cable, thick as his arm, and began hacking at the brittle, decaying insulation and wire. The knife chipped against the metal, sending tiny sparks flying. Below, the Cinder Man reached the pedestal. It didn't pause, it simply pressed its palm against the cold, black orb. Thomp, the orb pulsed violently. The red light inside flared. The Cinder Man, now fused temporarily to the power source, grew even more massive, its shape becoming more defined, terrifyingly humanoid. Vance finally severed the protective shielding, exposing the ancient copper wires beneath. He twisted his grip on the handle and jammed the knife straight down between the copper strands. Zzzzzzzt. Crackle, a weak, decades-dormant electrical current acted violently. The shock wasn't enough to kill him, but the searing pain caused Vance to release his grip. He fell, tumbling roughly from the ceiling. He hit the floor hard, inches from the waterline of the main tunnel, his head striking the cold brick. His vision swam, but the severed cables swung down. The frayed, live ends arced, dancing wildly above the orb, held back only by their thick, stiff insulation. The Cinder Man, however, did not wait. It stepped away from the orb, towering over Cruz, its enormous, dusty arm raised high. "Take the warmth," the entity shrieked in their minds. In a desperate, primal move, Cruz grabbed the first thing she could reach from the pedestal, the tarnished brass plaque she had just read. It was thin, metallic, and, relative to the core, warm. She thrust the plaque forward like a shield, hitting the creature's massive chest. The result was unexpected. The Cinder Man stopped, its movement stalling for a fraction of a second. The ash on its surface instantly adhered to the brass, but instead of calcifying the metal, the weight of all that accumulated ash seemed to stop the creature cold. It was a momentary, physical impedance. That fraction of a second was all Vance needed. Half dazed, he saw the dangling, arcing cables, and he saw Cruz struggling to hold back the towering ash monster. He spotted the pickaxe he had dropped in the main tunnel. The coolant flood had carried it right to the edge of the archway. Vance plunged his hand into the cold, swirling water, grabbing the tool. He staggered up and hurled the heavy pickaxe with all his remaining strength. It wasn't aimed at the Cinder Man. It was aimed at the cables. The heavy, metal pickaxe struck the dangling, live electrical wires. Kaboom! A blinding, cataclysmic explosion of electrical energy erupted. The full, residual charge of the ancient power grid, combined with the damp, conducting environment, discharged instantly. A massive, blue-white arc of current slammed down into the black orb. The noise was deafening, the light overwhelming. The black orb shattered inward, imploding, the dense, cold material disintegrating with a sharp, inward crackle of energy. The Cinder Man, in direct proximity, did not turn to ash. It simply ceased. The powerful, calcified structure instantly relaxed, collapsing into a monumental, inert pile of white, chalky powder that settled silently over Cruz and the pedestal. The intense, unnatural cold vanished. The chamber was still frigid and wet, but it was the familiar, mundane cold of a wet, subterranean tunnel. The heartbeat, the thrumming, the whispering, all were gone. Vance stumbled forward, his ears ringing, his eyes watering from the flash. Cruz emerged from the pile of dry ash, covered head to toe in white powder, coughing but alive. She held the brass plaque, which was now strangely warm in her hand. Elias, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Vance looked at the empty pedestal where the orb had been. The only remaining evidence was the colossal pile of white cinder and the shattered brickwork. He pulled his radio, which had been useless since they entered the structure, and held it to his lips. He keyed the mic, his voice a rasping whisper. Dispatch. This is Detective Vance. Code 10 to 67, the furnace is clear. Request 10 to 25, structural survey, ASAP. And send a 10-73 F11. We have a major hazard. Everything here is contaminated. Note, 10 to 67 is a fictional code for hazard neutralized, proceed with extreme caution. 10 to 25 is standard for report to /meet. 10 to 73 is standard for mentor subject, but the suffix F11 is a newly invented, fictional designation for psychological contamination / non-human incident. They had solved the case. The missing persons were dust, consumed to power a dark, ancient core. The horror was not an act of murder, but a force of nature, a chilling, thermodynamic engine of oblivion. But as they stood in the ruins of the core chamber, staring at the inert ash, Vance couldn't shake the fear. The entity had been composed of the waste product. How long, he wondered, until the Earth generated another heart. The aftermath of the Ash Heap Anomaly was not followed by celebration, but by a chilling, well-orchestrated silence. Within an hour of Vance's frantic, coded radio call, Precinct 13 was swarming, not with patrol officers, but with men in black, unmarked SUVs. They were agents from the Federal Oversight Division, FOD, led by a man named Director Sharp, whose face was a mask of calculated disinterest and cold authority. Sharp's team quickly designated Sector 7 an environmental disaster zone, citing a massive industrial coolant leak and a catastrophic electrical surge. They locked down the smelter and the entire utility tunnel network. Vance and Cruz were immediately separated. Cruz, covered head to toe in the inert white cinder dust, was debriefed for 16 hours straight. Her recollection of the Cinder Man, the black orb, and the telepathic whispers was met with polite, but firm, skepticism. Detective Cruz, Sharp said, leaning forward across the metal table, his voice a smooth, dangerous monotone. Your report mentions a large, mobile collection of ash, powered by an anti-furnace core. Are you aware that Dr. Sharma's forensic report confirms the white powder is 98% calcium carbonate, essentially, highly compressed limestone dust? A natural byproduct of the smelting process. It was not natural, Cruz insisted, her voice raw. It was moving, Director. It was cold and it was taking people's energy, their warmth. Sharp merely smiled, a thin, unnerving gesture. It was hallucination, Detective. Likely due to severe hypothermia, high-pressure water trauma, and the inhalation of particulate matter. The official report will state, massive structural failure caused by a cascade of maintenance neglect. The missing persons were vaporized in a secondary arc flash. The subtext was clear, you saw a ghost. You will report a malfunction. Vance, meanwhile, was undergoing a different kind of torture. He was placed on immediate administrative leave, mandatory psych evaluation pending. He was back in his desolate apartment, the only memory of the horror being the deep, agonizing muscle ache and a constant, dry itch that permeated his skin. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the twin slits of white light and heard the collective whisper, empty. Warm, Vance knew the cover-up was complete when he read the single-page, sanitized newspaper article, Old Smelter Site Sealed After Industrial Incident, 6 Missing Persons Presumed Casualties. There was no mention of the calcified watch, the perfect bare footprints, or the subterranean flood, but the real fear crept in. 2 days later. Cruz called him, her voice a tight note of panic. Elias, I need you to listen. I'm leaving town. They tried to give me a tranquilizer in my vitamins. Lena, calm down, Vance said, rubbing his temples. Where are you? It's the evidence, Elias, she rushed on. Remember the brass plaque? The one I used to stop the Cinder Man. I kept it. It was listed as unrecoverable by the FOD. I hid it in my locker. And it's not brass anymore. The ash, it's still reacting. Cruz described how the edges of the plaque were slowly turning white, flaking away into the same cold, fine powder. But the terrifying detail was what she had found on her own body. I found a patch of skin on my forearm, Elias. Where I was scraped by the cinder dust when I was covered by it. It looks like a cigarette burn, but it doesn't hurt. It's just white. I scraped it, and a tiny bit of powder came off. It's calcification, Elias. The code is in me. She was silent for a moment, then added, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper, and my apartment, it's getting colder. I can see my breath sometimes, even with the heat on. I think the ash is feeding on my own warmth. Before Vance could respond, the line clicked dead. Vance threw on his coat, the air in his own apartment suddenly feeling too thin, too chilly. He ran his hand over his face, realizing the dry itch on his skin had turned into a faint, powdery residue. He was contaminated. They both were. He had just reached his door when his old landline rang, a sound no one used anymore. He hesitated, then snatched the receiver. The voice on the other end was a low, resonant baritone. It was Director Sharp. Detective Vance. I trust you're settling into your mandatory leave. Vance clenched his jaw. Where's Cruz, Sharp? Detective Cruz is an unstable variable. She has been retrieved for further observation. Sharp paused, the sound of static and dry clicking filling the silence. But I didn't call about her. I called about you, Detective. You have the sickness now. The echo of Cinder. You are a mobile, regenerating energy source, Detective. And we can't have you walking around town. Sharp's tone shifted, becoming clinical, almost fatherly. The smelter was a containment unit built generations ago. You shattered it, Vance. You released the contagion. We need you to come in. Before you start to truly notice the silence. Vance felt a terrible coldness bloom deep in his chest, radiating outward. He instinctively knew what the silence was, the complete absence of heat, life, and soul. Go to hell, Sharp, Vance spat, slamming the phone down. He looked around his apartment. The glass of water on his nightstand had a thin, fresh rim of frost around it. Despite the room temperature being over 70 degrees, Vance snatched his keys, his wallet, and his personal, unregistered service weapon. He was no longer a detective solving a case. He was a fugitive carrying a silent, lethal infection. His next stop wasn't the precinct, but the city's oldest, darkest archive, the Department of Public Works, where the forgotten history of the Pyre-Steel Smelter lay buried in ancient, brittle files. He had to find out who built the core, and why. Detective Vance's breath feathered white in the cold air of his own apartment, a stark, chilling confirmation of Cruz's terror. The contagion was active. He was a walking furnace, and the infection was working to drain his heat. He bypassed the precinct and headed straight for the Department of Public Works, DPW, archives, a subterranean labyrinth beneath the city library, known for its suffocating silence and forgotten knowledge. He slipped past the skeleton crew using his old detective credentials and a practiced, authoritative scowl. The Pyre-Steel Smelter's original fires were bound in ancient, brittle leather, smelling of mildew and iron oxide. The blueprints were faded, but their structure was clear. The modern factory was built around something much older. Vance found the key, a handwritten memorandum from 1947, signed by the smelter's chief architect, a man named Dr. Alistair Thorne. The memo detailed the unique challenges of constructing the smelter on the site. The foundational strata contain an unparalleled geothermal flux. This energy is immense, stable, and requires immediate, permanent stabilization to prevent uncontrolled thermal expansion and potential seismic disaster. But the second half of the memo was scrawled on the back, marked, confidential, NON engineering. Stabilization requires a counteragent. We cannot dissipate the heat, we must contain and neutralize it. Utilizing specialized crystalline carbon composite, we are installing a thermodynamic sink at the geothermal nexus. This sink will not generate energy, but eternally consume it, creating a point of absolute thermal equilibrium. To sustain the constant entropy draw, the sink, the heart, requires occasional high-energy input from organic sources. The local transient population provides a continuous, untraceable supply of latent thermal mass. Vance dropped the brittle paper, his hands trembling. It wasn't an anomaly, or an ancient curse. It was calculated architectural evil. Dr. Alistair Thorne didn't build a smelter, he built a controlled entropy bomb, a machine designed to systematically consume human life to maintain the geothermal stability of the city itself. The entire industrial zone was a sophisticated, decades-long cover-up. The missing people weren't collateral damage, they were few. Vance knew the contamination in his body was his ticking clock. He needed to find Cruz and find Thorne, but he needed a weapon that could destroy the idea of the heart, not just its byproduct. He ran a quick search through the microfiche catalog, using the name Alistair Thorne. He found a single, shocking entry, Thorne, Dr. Alistair. 1903 to 1957. Death listed as cardiac arrest, sudden onset hypothermia. Body found in the DPW archives. Cause, self-inflicted. A note was recovered, the silence demands its architect. Thorne had died right here, consumed by his own creation, turning into another victim to feed the sink's insatiable cold. As Vance stared at the microfiche, a figure detached itself from the gloom at the end of the aisle. It was Director Sharp, flanked by two imposing men in dark suits. Detective Vance, Sharp said, his voice echoing coldly in the cavernous archive. You are an inconvenience, but also a valuable data point. You are a confirmed vector. The contagion is spreading through your warmth, seeking to reconstitute the sink's ability to create waste product, the Cinder Man. Vance reached for his weapon. Where is Cruz? She is at the primary containment facility, Sharp said, taking a slow step forward. She is stabilizing. Her internal temperature is dropping, but we are utilizing powerful external heat sources to maintain her core. A temporary solution. Sharp pointed to the small, white flakes on Vance's cheek. You, however, are accelerating. Your metabolism is running in reverse. We need to dissect the process before you freeze solid and the ash returns to the smelter site. Vance pulled his service weapon, the heavy metal of the barrel, a cold comfort in his hand. You're going to sacrifice us to keep your chip. Geothermal heat stable. Sharp sighed, sounding genuinely disappointed. Sacrifice. No, detective. We are maintaining the order of the city. A few transients, a few contaminated detectives, the small price to pay to keep 5 million people warm and safe. Thorne understood the balance. You upset it. Sharp nodded to his two silent guards. Take him. Do not damage the specimen. Vance didn't hesitate. He fired a shot high into the archive ceiling. Bang! The sound was enormous, shattering the silence. Ancient ventilation dust, cellulose, and disturbed air rained down. In the confusion, Vance bolted down a side aisle, leaving the federal agents to deal with the chaos and the potential collapse of the priceless, brittle archives. He knew where he needed to go, the containment facility. The smelter was the containment unit, but if Cruz was stabilizing, they must have moved her back to the source, the core chamber. He had a final theory, ripped from Thorne's paranoid scribbles. The sink wasn't just a battery, it was a vessel. And if it was a vessel, it needed a continuous, destructive reaction to be truly neutralized. He needed the one thing the Cinder Man hated and the core couldn't tolerate. He needed extreme, non-thermal kinetic energy. Vance fled the DPW archives, the knowledge of Dr. Thorne's thermodynamic sink burning in his mind. The coldness in his chest was spreading, a constant, dull ache that was slowly consuming his vitality. He was running out of heat, and therefore, running out of time. He knew the containment facility was the smelter's core chamber. Sharp wouldn't move Cruz far, the site was too sensitive, and the core chamber was the only place where the contamination could be monitored and temporarily suppressed, but he needed his weapon. The core, the black orb, was immune to bullets, electricity only stunned it, and water only forced it to regenerate its waste product, the Cinder Man. He needed to break the structure of the crystalline vessel itself. Recalling the destruction of the black orb, he realized the pickaxe strike, though accidental, was what initiated the electrocution, a sudden, intense kinetic shock followed by an electrical surge. He needed a pure, overwhelming kinetic strike. Vance drove his battered sedan not to the smelter's main gate, but to a derelict construction site a mile away, adjacent to the old rail yard. He used his last remaining connections, a gruff, retired demolition foreman named Mark he'd saved from a frame-up years ago, to secure what he needed. Mark, recognizing the desperation in Vance's voice, met him in the dark rail yard. You're asking for a military-grade tool, Elias, Mark grumbled, handing over a heavy, olive-drab rucksack. Used for splitting reinforced concrete pillars. This NC-4. This is a kinetic demolition charge. The bag contained a single, high-density, non-explosive block of composite material, roughly the size of a cinder block, designed to be fired from a specialized propellant casing. Its destructive power relied solely on velocity and concentrated mass, a focused, devastating punch of pure impact energy used to demolish rebar and thick concrete foundations without the collateral damage of a traditional explosion. It delivers enough pressure to crack a titanium safe, not just turn it into dust, Mark instructed, his eyes wary. But you need a clear shot and a stable launch point. Don't aim for the center. Hit the stress points. Vance nodded, his hands already feeling the unnatural cold of the charge through the canvas. I owe you everything, Mark. If I don't come back, tell Lena Cruz she was right. Vance slipped into Sector 7 through the sewer network that fed into the utility tunnels, timing his entry with the changing of the FOD patrol shift. The main tunnel was still half flooded, but the water had receded enough to make passage possible. He reached the core chamber. The heavy, newly installed steel door was guarded by two uniformed FOD agents, their posture tense and alert. Vance didn't try to sneak past. He chose the most violent, direct path. He loaded the kinetic demolition charge into its launch casing, bracing it against the rusted metal of the tunnel wall. He aimed not at the door, but at the ancient, stress-cracked brickwork beside the door, targeting the foundation directly above the opening. He pulled the trigger. Thwomp. The charge fired with a muted, powerful detonation of propellant. The solid, non-explosive projectile hit the brickwork with a sound like a wet sledgehammer smashing a diamond. The ancient brick wall didn't explode, it simply vaporized inward, turned into a fine cloud of pulverized stone dust and rubble. The kinetic force breached the wall, creating a massive, ragged opening wide enough for Vance to slip through. The two FOD agents inside the core chamber spun around, momentarily stunned by the sudden, silent breach. Vance rushed in. The chamber was unrecognizable. The massive pile of inert white cinder had been swept into the corners. In the center, a new, heavy-duty steel table had been set up. And on that table, under an array of intense, industrial heat lamps, lay Detective Lena Cruz. She was conscious, but her eyes were glazed with a terrifying fatigue. A white patch had spread from her arm up to her neck, and her lips were faintly blue. She was shivering uncontrollably, despite the intense heat. Elias, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Director Sharp stood over her, calmly adjusting the focus of a heat lamp. Predictable, Detective Vance. You were drawn to the heat source. We were waiting. Sharp pointed to a containment unit set up where the orb once sat, a clear, pressurized tube filled with the white ash, which was slowly, almost imperceptibly, pulsating. We are maintaining Cruz as a living heat reserve to keep the contagion stable, Sharp explained, his face utterly devoid of malice, treating the situation as a complex equation. The orb is gone, but the residual energy, the echo, is still here. And you, Detective, have brought the perfect solution. Sharp looked at the kinetic demolition charge launcher in Vance's hands. That projectile is pure impact. It won't trigger the explosive release, but it will shatter the fundamental crystalline structure of the original sink's base, the foundation itself. We can't allow you to break the foundation. That will release the geothermal energy, and we will lose the contamination. The two agents rushed Vance. He didn't fight them. He let them grab him, his body a dead weight, his remaining warmth draining away quickly. As the agents wrestled him, Vance could feel the intense, internal coldness of the contagion reaching his core. He had maybe a minute left before he seized up completely. He looked past Sharp, back at the site of the orb. The pedestal was gone, but the foundation was still there, a massive, 10-foot square section of perfectly black, dense, reinforced concrete, the ceiling of Thorne's original heart, and just below the surface of that black concrete, Vance could see a faint, rhythmic red pulse, the true, eternal core of the geothermal sink. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Vance broke free of the agent's grasp. He aimed the now empty launcher casing at the black foundation. If I freeze, Vance growled, his voice a cold rasp, the contagion comes back stronger. I'm going to take the heat out of the system for good. He jammed the butt of the launch casing into a crack in the foundation near the red pulse. He flipped a hidden release switch on the casing, activating its final, desperate function. A high-pitched whine began to scream from the casing. It was a self-destruct mechanism, designed to violently expel the heavy internal propellant rod with one last, massive kinetic smash. Get away from that! Sharp roared, finally losing his composure. Vance stared at the black foundation, ignoring the agents rushing him. He had one last chance to use his own heat, his life, as the detonator. The high-pitched, mechanical whine of the kinetic demolition charge casing self-destruct sequence screamed through the core chamber. The sound was non-stop, a warning that the heavy internal propellant rod was about to be violently expelled. Director Sharp and his two agents launched for Vance, but the detective, his strength failing from the spreading cold, collapsed deliberately, dragging the launch casing and its exposed propellant rod toward the center of the black foundation, the pulsating red light of the true core. Stop him. Don't touch the casing. Sharp roared, recognizing the lethality of the kinetic strike. They knew a conventional explosion would merely dissipate energy, but this calculated, focused impact could destabilize the core. Vance was numb. He could barely feel the cold concrete beneath his cheek. The white dusting of contamination was visible on his thinning hair and his skin. He was shutting down. He looked across the room at Cruz, lying under the oppressive heat lamps, her eyes wide with terror and understanding. She nodded, a subtle, weary acknowledgement of their shared, terrible necessity. The whining reached a fever pitch. Vance used his last flicker of heat and life to shove the launcher casing straight down, driving the exposed end of the propellant rod against the specific stress point he'd identified near the red glow. Crack. The propellant rod shot forward with devastating force. It was not a boom, but a single, clean, colossal impact. The concentrated mass hit the crystalline foundation with the force of a train slamming into bedrock. The black foundation did not crack, shatter, or burn. It seemed to implode upon itself, the impact energy driving straight into the geothermal nexus beneath. Simultaneously, the entire core chamber plunged into chaos. The red light vanished. The rhythmic thump of the sink's heartbeat ceased. The intense, unnatural cold that had permeated the smelter was abruptly gone, replaced by a rush of stifling, suffocating heat. The raw, uncontrolled geothermal energy that Dr. Thorne had spent his life containing. The floor beneath them buckled and groaned. The thermal containment is breached. Sharp screamed, his voice strained by panic. It's going seismic. Get the containment, Ash. The two agents rushed to the pressurized tube holding the inert Cinder Man, Ash, but it was too late. The change in energy state was instantaneous. The white, inert powder in the tube, which moments ago was cold, suddenly erupted into a blinding pillar of white-hot steam, the intense geothermal heat instantly vaporizing the residual moisture and calcified material. The steam cloud was so hot it blistered the paint on the walls. Sharp and his agents were caught in the thermal backlash, scrambling away from the deadly pressure release. Vance, however, felt something extraordinary. The internal coldness that had been consuming him recoiled. The raw, unleashed heat from the core, the warmth that the sink had been eternally consuming, surged upward. It was too much for the facility, but for Vance, it was salvation. The sudden rush of raw, non-transferable heat flooded his body, forcing the cold, calcified infection to retreat. He felt a blinding wave of pain, followed by a sensation of impossible, searing warmth. He was still alive, but barely conscious, lying in a puddle of hot, filthy water as the entire chamber shook. Cruz, seizing the opportunity, ripped herself free from the heat lamps. The white calcification on her skin was instantly gone, buoyed away by the pure, uncontrolled geothermal energy. She grabbed Vance, pulling his heavy, inert body toward the ragged hole he had created in the wall. We have to move, Elias. The ground's collapsing. The ceiling above the original archway began to crack open, showering them with debris and dust. Sharp, having regained his composure, staggered up, pulling a side arm. You fools! You killed the city's balance. Sharp yelled, aiming his pistol at Cruz. I cannot let you leave. The contagion data. Cruz didn't hesitate. She dragged Vance fully through the hole, covering his body with her own. Just as Sharp fired, the bullet didn't hit them. The ground beneath Sharp gave way with a sickening thwomp. The black foundation, its structure destroyed, collapsed inward onto the geothermal nexus. Sharp's horrified scream was cut short as he and the two agents plunged into the raw, superheated chasm created by the destabilized sink. Vance and Cruz were out. They crawled through the demolished breach, leaving the core chamber to tear itself apart behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the outer edge of Sector 7, covered in sweat, dirt, and the dust of the thermodynamic sink. The smelter building itself began to groan, its massive superstructure finally succumbing to the seismic stress of the unleashed geothermal energy. The echo of Cinder was gone. The cold was replaced by the terrifying, inevitable heat. Vance and Cruz scrambled away from Sector 7, the destruction behind them echoing like distant thunder. The colossal Pyre-Steel Smelter, which had stood as a monument of industrial dread for decades, was finally giving way, its concrete shell cracking under the massive internal thermal pressures. They heard the muffled sounds of metal shearing and deep, earth-shaking rumbles as the geothermal stability of the site failed catastrophically. They reached the edge of the industrial zone and collapsed in the dirt, adrenaline fading into crushing exhaustion. Vance checked Cruz. The white calcification on her skin was gone, leaving behind only raw, red, scalded skin, a nasty reminder of the heat surge that had saved them. "We did it," Cruz whispered, coughing up dust. "The sink, it's destroyed." Vance nodded, his body still vibrating from the thermal shock. The constant internal cold was replaced by a debilitating, pervasive overheating. His skin was clammy, and his heartbeat was erratic. The infection was neutralized, but the violent reaction had left him physically shattered. "We have minutes before the federal agencies mobilize," Vance rasped, struggling to his feet. "Sharp and his team are gone, but the FOD won't let us walk away. We know too much. We confirmed that the city's foundations are built on human sacrifice." They found a drainage ditch leading away from the site and followed it for miles until they reached the anonymity of the city's sprawling suburban fringe. The next day, the news reported a controlled demolition at the old smelter site, citing decades of neglect and safety hazards. The official narrative was seamless: the city was safe, the site was sealed, and the 6 missing persons remained presumed casualties of the blast. The FOD had executed a perfect, final cover-up. Vance and Cruz went dark. They moved through the shadows, selling what little they had. Their identities dissolved into the city's vast transient population, becoming the very people the thermodynamic sink was built to consume. But the horror was not truly over. The contagion had left them marked. For Cruz, the effects were psychological. She was constantly, obsessively seeking cold. She couldn't tolerate rooms above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. She slept with the windows open in the dead of winter, chasing the chill that had once almost killed her. She was haunted by the whisper of the Cinder Man, the collective cry of the consumed, empty. Warm, for Vance, the contamination had left a deeper physical scar. The cold was gone, replaced by a constant, overwhelming heat. His body was permanently running at an elevated temperature, constantly pushing off heat, almost radiating it. He could no longer regulate his thermal state. He found he couldn't touch things for long. A glass of cold water would warm to lukewarm instantly in his hands. A handshake felt like a burn. He was an accidental, miniature furnace, forever carrying the raw energy that had once been contained by the sink. He became a danger to the very woman he saved. One night, hiding out in a cheap motel room in the next state over, Cruz awoke shivering, pulling the blanket around her. Vance was sweating profusely beside her, his body temperature dangerously high. She reached out, placing a hand on his chest. "Elias," she murmured, "you're burning up." Vance flinched away, his eyes wide with a cold fear. He looked at the sheet where her hand had rested on his chest. A small, circular section of the cotton fabric had turned a dull, matte white, the fibers brittle and instantly destroyed by the concentrated heat. It wasn't calcification. It was the opposite. It was instantaneous, total combustion, leaving behind a spot of brittle, harmless white ash. "The core is gone, Lena," Vance whispered, pulling away. "But the energy it consumed, it's running through me. I'm the engine now. I'm the hearth." He realized the horror. The thermodynamic sink had not just consumed heat, it had transformed it into its opposite. By destroying the sink, Vance had reversed the process, becoming a conduit for the same destructive energy, only in the form of searing heat. He had become the worm the Cinder Man sought. They had destroyed the cold threat, but in doing so, they had created a new one. Vance was the physical embodiment of the city's dark, geothermal secret, a ticking, heat-radiating time bomb. They had saved the city from the cold, only to unleash a man who burned. Detective Vance stared at the patch of ash he had inadvertently burned into the motel sheet. He was the echo of Cinder's final, twisted result, the embodiment of the raw, consuming warmth that the thermodynamic sink had been built to contain. He was a danger to the world, and most terrifyingly, to Cruz, whose own internal system was now hypersensitized to cold. "I can't stay here, Lena," Vance said, his voice flat with resolve. "I'm a feedback loop. My body is pushing out the heat, and if I stay near you, you'll burn from the outside, or you'll compensate by getting colder until your system shuts down. Cruz, shivering under a pile of blankets, shook her head fiercely. No. We survived this together. We'll find a way to bleed the energy off. We can leave the city, go north, find perpetual snow, and burn it away. Vance cut in, standing up. This isn't just body heat, Lena. It's the geothermal energy of the earth, filtered through a machine designed to drain life. I'm too hot, and you're too cold. We're at opposite ends of the same equation, and our proximity is volatile. He knew what he had to do, a conclusion drawn from the archives of the DPW and the desperate logic of Dr. Thorne. The sink had required an eternal satiety. It demanded a final equilibrium. I need to go back to the source, Vance stated, grabbing his keys. Not the destroyed core, but the original geothermal flux. The Nexus. Vance left a distraught Cruz behind and drove back toward the scarred ruins of Sector 7. The government had thrown up a massive, perimeter fence, but the site was silent, officially a toxic zone. He approached the crater where the smelter once stood. The explosion had opened a vast, steaming chasm in the earth. The air was thick with sulfur and oppressive, raw heat, the true, untamed thermal pulse of the planet. Vance found a breach in the fence and descended into the wreckage. He was drawn, irresistibly, toward the center of the crater where the black foundation had imploded. The heat here was unbearable, but Vance felt a perverse sense of rightness. This was the only place his body felt truly comfortable. He climbed over broken rebar and molten rock until he reached a narrow shelf overlooking the deep, steaming fissure. The earth itself was exhaling. This was the raw, uncontained energy that Thorne had feared, and Vance was its avatar. He realized the thermodynamic truth: the system had been balanced, the heat below, the cold entity above. He had destroyed the cold entity, and now the heat entity, himself, needed to be neutralized to restore balance. Vance found the exact, searing point on the shelf where the geothermal radiation was most intense, where the air shimmered and metal glowed. He pulled out his old, heavy service weapon, the tool of the law that had failed him repeatedly against the supernatural, but which now served a final, personal purpose. He raised the pistol not to his head, but aimed it at his own chest, at the place where the cold contagion had first settled, and where the overwhelming heat now resided. The raw heat of the Nexus below was sucking the residual energy from his body, creating a final, violent transfer. Vance felt his remaining vitality rush out of him. He knew the moment he died, the energy would dissipate back into the earth, achieving the final equilibrium. He placed his finger on the trigger, looking up one last time at the weak, cold city light piercing the smoke band. Vance's body never hit the searing rock. The final, explosive thermal discharge from his core was so violent and instantaneous that it didn't leave a body to find. His physical form, overloaded with raw geothermal energy, was simply and utterly combusted, reduced to a burst of white-hot plasma that vaporized instantly into the atmosphere, leaving behind no ash, no residue, and no trace of the contamination. The sudden, powerful release of the contained energy achieved the final, necessary entropy. The earth beneath the smelter side, and the violent thermal activity slowly began to subside, finding a new, natural equilibrium. Weeks later, Detective Lena Cruz was living far away, in the small, perpetually freezing town of Nome, Alaska. She had changed her name, her hair, and her life, finding a strange kind of peace in the constant, dull cold. It kept her body in check and, ironically, reminded her that she was alive. She never reported Vance's disappearance. She knew his final act was not suicide, but a solution, the ultimate sacrifice to destroy the contagion completely. One evening, staring out at the endless, frozen landscape, she received an anonymous, untraceable package in the mail. Inside was a small, plain wooden box. It contained only one thing, the tarnished brass plaque from the thermodynamic sink's pedestal, but it was different now. The residual heat from Vance's final, desperate embrace had acted as a final, controlled purification. The plaque was no longer tarnished brass. It was clean, smooth, and etched into its center, not by hot metal, but by some kind of final, desperate pressure, was a single, New World Center warmth cruise picked up the plaque. It was perfectly, wonderfully lukewarm, the exact temperature of a healthy human heart. She was cold, but she was safe. The echo of Cinder was gone, replaced by a haunting, silent equilibrium. She was the only remaining witness to the city's terrible secret,